The scorching Afghan sun beat down mercilessly on forward operating base Chapman as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos limped through the dusty compound, her left leg dragging slightly behind her. The improvised explosive device that had torn through her patrol vehicle 3 weeks ago had left her with shrapnel wounds and a damaged knee that refused to heal properly. Despite the pain that shot through her leg with every step, she maintained the disciplined posture that had been drilled into her since boot camp at Parris Island. Maria had served 2 previous deployments in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan before this current rotation. At 28, she was a decorated Marine with a Combat Action Ribbon, Purple Heart, and more commendations than most soldiers earned in an entire career. Her expertise in explosive ordnance disposal had saved countless lives, and her leadership during firefights had earned the respect of every Marine in her unit. But respect seemed to be in short supply at FOB Chapman, especially from the Army personnel who made up the majority of the base's population. The medical tent was her destination this morning, same as every morning for the past 3 weeks. The Navy Hospital Corpsman Second Class Rodriguez had been treating her wounds with professional care, but the Army doctors who ran the facility treated her like an inconvenience. They questioned her pain levels, suggested she was exaggerating her symptoms, and made snide comments about Marines who couldn't handle a little discomfort. As Maria approached the medical tent, she noticed a group of Army soldiers standing near the entrance. Sergeant First Class Bradley Morrison, a tall man with permanent sneer lines around his eyes, spotted her coming and nudged his companions. Morrison had been deployed to Afghanistan for 8 months and considered himself a veteran of the war, though his role in logistics meant he rarely left the safety of the base perimeter. "Here comes Gimpy again," Morrison said, loud enough for Maria to hear. Amazing how these Marines always seem to find ways to get out of real work. Private First Class Jenkins, a young soldier who had arrived at the base only 2 months ago, laughed nervously. Maybe she should have stayed in the kitchen where she belongs. Specialist Thompson, Morrison's closest friend and frequent partner in harassment, added his own commentary. "I heard she was crying like a baby when they brought her in. Some warrior." Maria kept walking, her jaw clenched tight. She had endured worse treatment during her years in the Corps, and she wasn't about to give these soldiers the satisfaction of seeing her react. The pain in her leg flared as she climbed the steps to the medical tent, but she refused to let it show on her face. Inside the tent, she found Rodriguez preparing medical supplies for the morning rounds. The young corpsman looked up and smiled warmly when he saw her. Rodriguez had served with Marines before and understood the culture of toughness and resilience that defined the Corps. "Morning, Staff Sergeant," Rodriguez said. "How's the leg feeling today?" "Same as always, Doc," Maria replied, settling onto the examination table. "Could use some of that miracle healing you Navy guys are famous for." Rodriguez chuckled as he began examining her wounds. "If I had miracle healing powers, I'd be charging a lot more than what the Navy pays me." As he worked, Maria could hear Morrison and his friend still talking outside the tent. Their voices carried clearly through the thin fabric walls, and it was obvious they intended for her to hear every word. "You know what I think?" Morrison was saying. "I think she's milking this injury for all it's worth, trying to get a medical discharge so she can collect disability for the rest of her life." "That's what these females do," Thompson agreed. "They want all the benefits of being in combat units without any of the real risks." Rodriguez's hands paused in their work, and Maria saw his expression darken. The corpsman had seen Maria's medical records and knew exactly how severe her injuries were. He had also read her service record and understood that she had more combat experience than Morrison and Thompson combined. "Doc," Maria said quietly, "just patch me up so I can get out of here." Rodriguez nodded and continued his work in silence, but Maria could see the anger in his eyes. The corpsman finished cleaning and redressing her wounds, then handed her a small bottle of pain medication. "Take these as needed," Rodriguez said. "And, Staff Sergeant, don't let those idiots get to you. Some of us know what you've sacrificed for this country." Maria thanked him and prepared to leave the tent. As she pushed through the entrance flap, she found Morrison and his group still waiting outside, apparently having nothing better to do than harass wounded Marines. "All done with your spa treatment, princess?" Morrison asked with exaggerated sweetness. Maria stopped and turned to face him directly. "Something you want to say to me, Sergeant?" Morrison stepped closer, emboldened by the presence of his friends. "Yeah, actually, I'm saying you're taking up medical resources that real wounded warriors need. Maybe if you spent less time complaining and more time doing your job, you wouldn't be such a burden on the rest of us." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Maria felt every instinct in her body telling her to put Morrison on the ground, but she also knew that any physical altercation would only prove his point in the eyes of the chain of command. Instead, she did something that surprised everyone present, including herself. She started to laugh. "You think this is funny?" Morrison demanded, his face reddening with anger. "I think you're funny," Maria replied, still chuckling. A logistics specialist who's never been outside the wire, lecturing a combat veteran about what it means to be a warrior. "Yeah, that's pretty hilarious." Morrison's anger flared into rage. "You don't know anything about what I've done or where I've been. I know you've been sitting behind a desk counting supplies while real Marines have been out there fighting," Maria shot back. "I know you've never had to disarm a bomb while under enemy fire or carry a wounded teammate to safety while being shot at. And I know you're too much of a coward to actually test yourself against someone who might fight back." The confrontation was drawing attention from other personnel around the medical tent. Several soldiers had stopped to watch, and Maria noticed a few Marines from her own unit approaching from across the compound. She also spotted something else that made her smile inwardly: a small group of Navy SEALs who had been passing by and had paused to observe the situation. Morrison was clearly struggling to maintain his composure. "You think you're so tough because you're a Marine? Let me tell you something, sweetheart, Sergeant Morrison." The voice cut through the tension like a blade. Morrison spun around to find Master Chief Petty Officer Daniel Reeves standing behind him. Reeves was a SEAL with 22 years of service and a reputation that preceded him throughout the special operations community. He was tall and lean with graying hair and eyes that seemed to look right through whoever he was addressing. "Master Chief," Morrison stammered, suddenly remembering military courtesy. "Is there a problem here?" Reeves asked, his voice calm, but carrying an undertone that suggested he already knew the answer. "No problem, Master Chief," Morrison replied quickly. "Just having a conversation with a Marine here." Reeves looked at Maria, taking in her obvious injuries and the medical supplies she was carrying. "Staff Sergeant, are you being properly cared for by our medical personnel?" "Yes, Master Chief," Maria replied. "Hospital Corpsman Rodriguez has been excellent." "Good," Reeves said, then turned his attention back to Morrison. "Sergeant, I couldn't help but overhear part of your conversation. Did I hear you correctly in suggesting that this Marine is somehow shirking her duties?" Morrison's face went pale. We were discussing. Because I've read Staff Sergeant Santos's service record," Reeves continued, his tone remaining conversational. 3 combat deployments, Purple Heart, Combat Action Ribbon, Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with V device for valor. 37 confirmed IED disposals under fire. More combat experience than most soldiers will see in their entire careers. The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison stood frozen, apparently unable to find words to respond. His friends had quietly melted away, suddenly remembering urgent duties elsewhere. "What's your combat experience, Sergeant Morrison?" Reeves asked. I serve in a support role, Master Chief," Morrison managed. "I see. And how many times have you left this base to conduct operations outside the wire?" Morrison's silence was answer enough. "Master Chief," Maria said, stepping forward. "This really isn't necessary." Reeves looked at her with something that might have been respect. "Perhaps not, Staff Sergeant. But sometimes things need to be said clearly, so there's no confusion later." He turned back to Morrison, who was now visibly sweating despite the early morning hour. "Sergeant, I want to make sure I understand the situation correctly. You believe that a decorated combat veteran who was wounded in service to her country is somehow taking advantage of medical resources? No, Master Chief, Morrison said quickly. I think there was a misunderstanding. I think so too, Reeves agreed. Because if I thought for one moment that anyone on this base was disrespecting wounded warriors, especially Marine warriors who have bled for this country, I would have to take that very seriously indeed. Morrison nodded rapidly. Understood, Master Chief. Excellent, Reeves said with a cold smile. I'm sure Staff Sergeant Santos won't have any more problems with harassment while she's recovering from her wounds. It wasn't really a question, and Morrison clearly understood that. No, Master Chief. No problems at all. Reeves nodded once, then looked at Maria. Staff Sergeant, if you need anything during your recovery, please don't hesitate to ask. The SEAL team on this base considers it an honor to serve alongside Marines of your caliber. With that, he walked away, leaving Morrison standing alone and humiliated. The sergeant looked around at the faces watching him, found no sympathy anywhere, and quickly departed in the opposite direction. Maria stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. She had fought her own battles for so long that having someone else step in felt strange, but she had to admit it was also gratifying to see Morrison put in his place. As she made her way back to her unit's area of the base, she reflected on the incident. She had no way of knowing that Master Chief Reeves had already made some decisions about Sergeant Morrison and his friends, or that the next few weeks would prove to be very educational for anyone who thought it was acceptable to disrespect wounded Marines. The sun climbed higher in the Afghan sky, and the daily routine of military life continued around the base. But something had changed in those few minutes outside the medical tent. Word would spread quickly through the tight-knit community of the forward operating base, and everyone would soon know that the SEALs had taken notice of how certain Army personnel were treating wounded Marines. Morrison and his friends had no idea what they had set in motion with their casual cruelty and disrespect. They couldn't have imagined that their behavior would soon become the focus of some very unwelcome attention from men whose job it was to eliminate threats to American interests. The stage was set for a lesson in respect that none of them would ever forget. 3 days after the confrontation outside the medical tent, life at Forward Operating Base Chapman had seemingly returned to normal. Sergeant First Class Morrison went about his logistics duties with renewed attention to military courtesy, at least when ranking personnel were nearby. He had learned to keep his comments about Staff Sergeant Santos to himself when others might be listening, but his resentment had only grown stronger with time. What Morrison didn't know was that Master Chief Reeves had shared the details of their encounter with the other members of SEAL Team 7. The team had been conducting training exercises and preparing for upcoming missions, but they had also been quietly observing the dynamics on the base with professional interest. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Washington, Reeves' second-in-command, was a massive man who had played college football before joining the Navy. He had been on 4 combat deployments with the SEALs and had a particular hatred for anyone who disrespected service members who had shed blood for their country. When Reeves told him about Morrison's treatment of the wounded Marine, Washington's response was immediate and decisive. "We need to teach these guys some manners," Washington said during a team meeting in their secure area of the base. Petty Officer First Class James Rodriguez, no relation to the hospital corpsman, was the team's communications specialist and former Army Ranger. "What kind of lesson are we talking about, Chief?" "The educational kind," Washington replied with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "The kind that helps people understand why respect for warriors isn't optional." Master Chief Reeves studied his men carefully. He understood their anger because he felt it himself, but any action they took had to be measured and appropriate. "We're not going to do anything that reflects poorly on the teams or compromises our mission," he said firmly. "But I think it's reasonable to ensure that all personnel on this base understand proper military courtesy." Petty Officer Second Class Tyler Brooks, the team's youngest member at 24, raised his hand slightly. "Master Chief, what if we just made sure these guys got some additional training opportunities? Help them become better soldiers?" The suggestion hung in the air for a moment before Reeves smiled. "That's an excellent idea, Brooks. I think some additional physical training and military bearing instruction would benefit everyone involved. What followed was a carefully orchestrated campaign that began the next morning. Morrison and his two closest associates, Specialist Thompson and Private First Class Jenkins, found themselves selected for a variety of special duties and training exercises that seemed to come out of nowhere. It started when Morrison reported for his normal shift in the supply depot. He had barely settled at his desk when Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, the base supply officer, appeared with a clipboard and a stern expression. "Sergeant Morrison," Harrison said, "I've reviewed our inventory procedures and found several discrepancies that need immediate attention. You'll be conducting a complete physical count of all ammunition stores, starting immediately." Morrison blinked in surprise. The ammunition storage area was a series of concrete bunkers located on the far side of the base, each one requiring hours of careful counting and documentation. "Sir, that's usually a team job. Will I have assistance?" "Negative," Harrison replied. "This is a thorough audit, and I need someone I can trust to handle it personally. Chief Washington from the SEAL team has volunteered to observe and ensure proper procedures are followed." At the mention of Chief Washington's name, Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. The massive SEAL had been present during his humiliation outside the medical tent, and Morrison had no desire to spend time alone with him in isolated bunkers. "Sir, I really think this would be more efficient with additional personnel." Morrison tried again. "Sergeant," Harrison said with finality, "this is not a request. Report to Chief Washington at the Armory in 15 minutes. Meanwhile, Specialist Thompson was discovering his own new responsibilities. Captain Rodriguez, the base maintenance officer, had personally assigned him to what was described as critical infrastructure maintenance. This turned out to involve cleaning and inspecting every latrine on the base, a job that typically rotated among the newest enlisted personnel. "Sir," Thompson protested, "I'm not really qualified for this kind of work. Shouldn't this go to someone in sanitation?" Captain Rodriguez consulted his clipboard with exaggerated seriousness. "Actually, Thompson, I specifically requested you for this assignment. Master Chief Reeves mentioned that you had expressed interest in taking on additional responsibilities." Thompson's face went white. He had never spoken to Master Chief Reeves about anything, and he certainly hadn't volunteered for latrine duty. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Rodriguez replied cheerfully. "Petty Officer Brooks will be supervising your work to ensure it meets Navy standards. He should be along shortly to get you started." Private First Class Jenkins was experiencing his own version of special attention. He had been assigned to what Sergeant Major Williams described as enhanced physical fitness training under the direct supervision of Petty Officer First Class Rodriguez. This training was scheduled to take place during what had previously been his off-duty hours, and it promised to be significantly more intense than the standard Army physical training regimen. "But, Sergeant Major," Jenkins whined, "I already passed my PT test this quarter." "That's Army standards, son," Sergeant Major Williams explained with mock sympathy. "Petty Officer Rodriguez thinks you might benefit from experiencing what real military fitness looks like. Consider it professional development." By noon, all three soldiers were discovering that their new assignments were far more challenging than they had anticipated. Morrison found himself in the first ammunition bunker with Chief Washington, whose idea of observation involved providing detailed commentary on proper lifting techniques, counting procedures, and the importance of attention to detail. "Move faster, Morrison," Washington said, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "In combat situations, ammunition resupply has to happen quickly and accurately. Lives depend on it." Morrison struggled to lift a heavy crate of artillery shells, his back already aching from 2 hours of constant labor. "Chief, couldn't we use some kind of mechanical assistance for this?" "Could," Washington agreed, watching Morrison strain with the crate. "But this is training, remember? Building character and physical strength. Plus, it gives us time to talk about military values." The conversation that followed was deeply uncomfortable for Morrison. Chief Washington had an encyclopedic knowledge of military history and seemed particularly interested in discussing examples of units that had shown exceptional courage and sacrifice. He talked about Medal of Honor recipients, soldiers who had died protecting their comrades, and the sacred bonds that existed between warriors who had shed blood together. See, the thing about real warriors, Washington said as Morrison struggled with another crate, is that they understand sacrifice isn't just about what you do in combat. It's about how you treat the people who have already made sacrifices for you. Morrison said nothing, but sweat was pouring down his face despite the air conditioning in the bunker. Take Staff Sergeant Santos, for example. Washington continued conversationally. 3 combat deployments, multiple decorations for valor, wounded in service to her country. That's the kind of Marine who deserves respect from every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine on this base. The message was unmistakable, and Morrison found himself nodding agreement, even as his muscles screamed in protest. Across the base, Specialist Thompson was having his own educational experience. Petty Officer Brooks had proven to be a demanding supervisor with very specific standards for cleanliness and sanitation. Every latrine had to be spotless, every surface disinfected, and every fixture polished to a mirror shine. This isn't really about cleaning toilets, Brooks said as he watched Thompson scrub grout with a toothbrush. This is about attention to detail and taking pride in your work. Thompson looked up from his position on his hands and knees. Petty Officer, I understand the value of cleanliness, but this seems excessive. Excessive, Brooks repeated, raising an eyebrow. You know what's excessive? Disrespecting wounded warriors who have given more for this country than you'll probably ever understand. The young SEAL's tone was mild, but Thompson caught the underlying steel in his words. He returned to his scrubbing without further comment. See, the way I figure it, Brooks continued, if you're going to talk trash about Marines who have earned their stripes in combat, you better be prepared to prove that you understand what real work looks like. Thompson's face burned with embarrassment, but he kept scrubbing. Private First Class Jenkins was discovering that SEAL-style physical training was in a completely different category from anything the Army had shown him. Petty Officer First Class Rodriguez had him running obstacle courses, performing endless sets of push-ups and pull-ups, and practicing combat movement techniques that left him gasping for air. Pick up the pace, Jenkins, Rodriguez called out as the young soldier struggled through a series of bear crawls. Marines like Staff Sergeant Santos have to maintain this kind of physical standard even when they're wounded. Think you can keep up? Jenkins wanted to point out that he wasn't a Marine and hadn't volunteered for this extra training, but he didn't have enough breath to speak. His entire body was on fire, and they were only 30 minutes into what Rodriguez had promised would be a 3-hour session. You know what I learned in the Rangers? Rodriguez said, not even breathing hard as he jogged alongside Jenkins. I learned that respect isn't something you get automatically. You earn it by proving you understand what sacrifice means. Jenkins stumbled and fell face first into the dirt. Rodriguez helped him up with surprising gentleness. I also learned, Rodriguez continued, that real warriors take care of each other. They don't tear each other down, especially when someone's already hurting. Jenkins nodded frantically, still trying to catch his breath. Staff Sergeant Santos is a real warrior, Rodriguez said simply. And real warriors deserve better than what she got from you and your friends. By evening, Morrison, Thompson, and Jenkins were exhausted, humiliated, and beginning to understand that their behavior towards Staff Sergeant Santos had consequences they hadn't anticipated. They met for dinner in the chow hall, comparing their experiences in hushed tones. This is harassment, Morrison said, pushing food around on his plate without eating. They can't treat us like this just because we had a conversation with some Marine. It wasn't just a conversation, Jenkins said quietly. We were being jerks, and everyone knows it. Thompson nodded reluctantly. Maybe we went too far. Went too far. Morrison's voice rose slightly, then dropped when he noticed several SEALs sitting at a nearby table. They're making us look like idiots in front of the whole base. Maybe that's the point, Jenkins said. Maybe they want everyone to know what happens when you disrespect wounded veterans. Morrison started to argue, but His words died when he saw Staff Sergeant Santos enter the chow hall. She was still limping, still obviously in pain, but she carried herself with the dignity and bearing that came from years of military service and multiple combat deployments. For the first time since the incident outside the medical tent, Morrison really looked at her. He saw the Purple Heart ribbon on her uniform, the combat action ribbon that indicated she had been under enemy fire, and the other decorations that told the story of a career spent in service to her country. He also saw something else, the way other Marines greeted her with obvious respect and affection. These were hard men and women who had also seen combat, and their treatment of Santos made it clear that she was one of their own, someone who had earned her place among warriors. "Oh, man," Thompson said quietly. "We really screwed up, didn't we?" Before anyone could answer, Master Chief Reeves appeared at their table. The three soldiers scrambled to their feet, snapping to attention. "Gentlemen," Reeves said pleasantly, "how was your first day of enhanced training?" "Very educational, Master Chief," Morrison managed. "Excellent," Reeves replied. "I'm glad to hear that. You know, I was just talking to Staff Sergeant Santos, and she mentioned that she hasn't received any apologies for the harassment she experienced a few days ago." The silence that followed was deafening. "Now, I'm not saying anyone owes her an apology," Reeves continued with a slight smile. "But I do think it's interesting that three soldiers who claim to understand military values haven't yet demonstrated that understanding through their actions." Morrison felt sweat breaking out on his forehead again. "Master Chief, no need to explain anything to me, Sergeant," Reeves interrupted. "Your actions going forward will speak much louder than anything you could say right now." He paused, looking at each of them in turn. "Oh, and gentlemen, your enhanced training program will continue until I'm satisfied that you've learned everything you need to know about respect and military courtesy. Sweet dreams." With that, he walked away, leaving the three soldiers to contemplate their situation and wonder exactly how much worse things could get. The second week of enhanced training proved to be even more challenging than the first. Morrison, Thompson, and Jenkins had thought their initial assignments were punishment enough, but they quickly learned that the SEALs had a much more comprehensive education plan in mind. Morrison found himself assigned to what Master Chief Reeves described as leadership development exercises. This involved serving as the primary liaison between the SEAL team and various other units on the base, a job that required him to coordinate training schedules, equipment requests, and facility usage with some of the most demanding special operations personnel in the military. The thing about leadership, Chief Washington explained as Morrison struggled to keep up with a list of requirements for an upcoming SEAL training exercise, is that it requires understanding the people you're supposed to be leading. Morrison was frantically scribbling notes as Washington rattled off specifications for ammunition requirements, training facility reservations, and safety protocols. "Chief, could you slow down just a little?" "Can't slow down in combat, Morrison," Washington replied without missing a beat. "When Marines like Staff Sergeant Santos are calling for backup ammunition during a firefight, they need supply personnel who can think fast and act faster." The comparison to Santos stung, and Morrison knew it was intentional. Every conversation with the SEALs seemed to circle back to examples of courage and competence that made his own behavior look pathetic by comparison. "Chief," Morrison said carefully, "I want you to know that I've been thinking about what happened with Staff Sergeant Santos." Washington stopped dictating requirements and fixed Morrison with a steady stare. "Have you now?" "Yes, Chief. And I realized that my behavior was inappropriate and unprofessional." "Inappropriate and unprofessional," Washington repeated slowly. "Is that how you describe harassment of a wounded combat veteran?" Morrison felt heat creeping up his neck. "Chief, it was worse than that. It was disrespectful and wrong." Washington nodded slowly. "Better. But recognition is just the first step, Sergeant. The question is what you plan to do about it." Before Morrison could answer, Washington handed him another clipboard. "Here's your next assignment. The base commander wants a complete report on supply chain efficiency for combat medical supplies. You'll be working directly with Hospital Corpsman Rodriguez to understand how medical supplies get distributed in combat situations. Morrison took the clipboard with a sinking heart. Working with Rodriguez meant spending time in a medical facility, which meant potentially encountering Staff Sergeant Santos during her daily treatments. "Chief," Morrison began, "maybe someone else would be better suited for this assignment." "Nope," Washington said firmly. "You're the perfect person for this job. In fact, I specifically requested you." Meanwhile, Specialist Thompson was discovering that his cleaning duties had evolved into something much more complex and demanding. Petty Officer Brooks had assigned him to maintain the memorial area of the base, a solemn space dedicated to fallen service members from all branches of the military. The memorial consisted of a small garden with stone markers bearing the names of soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen who had died in service to their country. Maintaining it required careful attention to detail, respect for the significance of the space, and a level of reverence that Thompson had never been required to demonstrate before. "This isn't just about keeping things clean," Brooks explained as Thompson carefully polished a memorial plaque. "This is about understanding what sacrifice really means." Thompson read the names on the memorial markers as he worked. Most were young men and women, many younger than he was. Some had died in combat, others in training accidents or from wounds sustained in service. Each name represented a family that had lost someone, a unit that had mourned a fallen comrade, and a nation that had been diminished by the loss. "See this one?" Brooks pointed to a marker bearing the name of a Marine corporal who had died 3 years earlier. "She was about your age when an IED took out her convoy. Posthumously awarded the Bronze Star for pulling wounded Marines to safety before the blast killed her." Thompson felt something twist in his stomach as he read the inscription. The Marine had been 22 when she died, just 2 years older than he was now. And this one, Brooks continued, indicating another marker, Army medic who died treating wounded soldiers under fire. Saved 6 lives before he took shrapnel that severed his femoral artery. Each story was different, but they all shared common themes of courage, sacrifice, and devotion to fellow service members. As Thompson worked to maintain the memorial, he found himself thinking about Staff Sergeant Santos and the wounds she carried from her own service. "Petty Officer," Thompson said quietly, "how do you cope with knowing that people have died for this country while others just complain about minor inconveniences?" Brooks studied him for a long moment. "That's the right question, Thompson. And the answer is that you honor their sacrifice by being worthy of it." "How do you do that?" "By understanding that every person who puts on a uniform deserves respect until they prove otherwise," Brooks replied. "By taking care of the wounded and supporting those who have given more than you have. By never taking for granted what others have suffered to protect." Thompson nodded, feeling ashamed of his previous attitude towards Santos and other wounded veterans. Private First Class Jenkins was experiencing his own form of education through an intensive combat medical training program designed and supervised by Hospital Corpsman Rodriguez. The training was supposedly to help him qualify for additional duties, but Jenkins quickly realized it was actually a crash course in understanding the realities of combat medicine. "When Marines get wounded in combat," Rodriguez explained as he demonstrated proper battlefield first aid techniques, "every second counts. The person providing medical aid has to be competent, calm, and completely focused on saving lives." Jenkins practiced applying pressure bandages to simulated wounds, learning to work quickly while maintaining the steady hand required for medical procedures. It was harder than it looked, especially when Rodriguez added stress factors like loud noises and time pressure. Staff Sergeant Santos has been on the receiving end of this kind of care multiple times, Rodriguez continued. IED blast, small arms fire, shrapnel wounds from mortar attacks. Each time, someone else risked their own life to pull her to safety and treat her injuries. Jenkins fumbled with a pressure bandage as he tried to imagine being wounded and depending on someone else to save his life. The thought was terrifying and humbling at the same time. "Corpsman," Jenkins said during a break in the training, "why are you spending so much time teaching me this stuff?" "I'm not planning to be a medic," Rodriguez set down his training materials and looked directly at Jenkins. Because I want you to understand what it feels like to be responsible for someone else's life. I want you to know what it means when a wounded warrior trusts you to take care of them. Jenkins nodded slowly, beginning to understand the lesson behind the lesson. Staff Sergeant Santos has trusted people with her life more times than you can count, Rodriguez continued. She's earned the right to expect respect and support from everyone who wears the same uniform she does. The words hit Jenkins like a physical blow. He thought about his comments outside the medical tent, his casual dismissal of Santos's injuries, and his assumption that she was somehow taking advantage of the system. "Corpsman," Jenkins said quietly. "I owe her an apology, don't I?" "That's not for me to say," Rodriguez replied. "But I will tell you that real warriors take responsibility for their mistakes." By the middle of the second week, word of the SEALs educational campaign had spread throughout the base. Other personnel watched with fascination as Morrison, Thompson, and Jenkins were put through their paces by some of the most elite soldiers in the military. The message was clear to everyone. Disrespecting wounded veterans would not be tolerated. The three soldiers were exhausted, humiliated, and increasingly aware of how poorly they had behaved. But they were also learning lessons that would stay with them for the rest of their military careers. Morrison's work with medical supply logistics had given him a new appreciation for the complexity of combat medicine and the courage required of both medical personnel and the wounded warriors they treated. Thompson's maintenance of the memorial had forced him to confront the reality of military sacrifice in a way that his previous duties had never required. Jenkins's medical training had shown him the skill and bravery required to save lives under fire. Most importantly, all three were beginning to understand that Staff Sergeant Santos represented something much larger than just one wounded Marine. She was part of a brotherhood and sisterhood of warriors who had earned their place through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Disrespecting her was disrespecting everyone who had ever put their life on the line for their country. The education was far from over, but the foundation had been laid. The SEALs had demonstrated that they would not tolerate disrespect for wounded veterans, and they had done it in a way that was both professional and devastatingly effective. Master Chief Reeves observed the progress with satisfaction. His men had handled the situation perfectly, teaching important lessons without crossing any lines that would reflect poorly on the team. But he also knew that the real test would come when Morrison, Thompson, and Jenkins had to face Staff Sergeant Santos again and demonstrate whether they had truly learned anything from their experience. That test was coming sooner than any of them realized. Plans were already in motion for a base-wide ceremony that would honor wounded veterans, and everyone would be watching to see how the three soldiers conducted themselves when faced with the Marine they had disrespected. The SEALs had taught their lesson well, but the final exam was still to come. The third week of enhanced training brought an unexpected development that would test everything Morrison, Thompson, and Jenkins had supposedly learned. Intelligence reports indicated increased insurgent activity in the region around Forward Operating Base Chapman, and the base commander ordered all personnel to elevated alert status. For the SEALs, this meant immediate preparation for potential combat operations. For Morrison and his friends, it meant their educational program was about to become much more intense and realistic. Master Chief Reeves called the three soldiers to a briefing room early on Monday morning. When they arrived, they found him studying tactical maps with Chief Washington and the rest of the SEAL team. "Gentlemen," Reeves said without looking up from the maps, "the tactical situation has changed. We may be conducting operations outside the wire in the next few days, which means we need reliable support personnel." Morrison felt his stomach drop. "Master Chief, are you saying we might be going on missions with you?" "I'm saying you've been selected to provide logistics and communication support for potential SEAL operations," Reeves replied. "Consider it the practical application portion of our training program." Thompson's face went white. "Master Chief, I don't think we're qualified for that kind of assignment." Reeves finally looked up from the maps, his expression unreadable. "Really? Because according to your service records, you've all completed basic combat training. Are you telling me that training was inadequate? The question hung in the air like a challenge. None of the three soldiers could claim their training was inadequate without admitting they were incompetent, but none of them felt ready for the kind of high-intensity operations the SEALs conducted. Master Chief, Morrison said carefully, I think we would benefit from additional preparation before supporting special operations missions. Excellent attitude, Reeves replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. That's exactly what we're going to provide. You'll be attached to the team for intensive pre-deployment training starting immediately. What followed was the most demanding week of military training any of the three soldiers had ever experienced. The SEALs put them through combat scenarios that tested their physical stamina, mental toughness, and ability to function under extreme stress. They practiced house-to-house clearing operations, convoy security procedures, and emergency medical response scenarios. They learned to communicate using hand signals, navigate in darkness, and maintain their equipment under field conditions. Most importantly, they learned what it meant to depend on their teammates for survival. In combat, your life depends on the person next to you, Petty Officer Rodriguez explained during a particularly grueling training exercise. And their life depends on you. There's no room for personal conflicts or disrespect when people are shooting at you. The three soldiers were exhausted, but they were also beginning to understand the bonds that held military units together. They saw how the SEALs trusted each other completely, how they communicated without words, and how they were willing to risk everything for their teammates. This is what Staff Sergeant Santos experienced on every deployment. Chief Washington observed as Morrison struggled to carry his equipment during a long-distance patrol simulation. Except she did it while responsible for disarming bombs that could kill her entire unit. Morrison said nothing, but his respect for the wounded Marine was growing with every hour of training. Meanwhile, Staff Sergeant Santos was dealing with her own challenges. Her physical therapy was progressing slowly, and the doctors were beginning to discuss the possibility of medical discharge if her knee didn't heal properly. The prospect of ending her Marine Corps career due to injury was devastating, but she faced it with the same stoic determination that had carried her through multiple combat deployments. She was unaware of the intensive training program that the three Army soldiers were undergoing, but she had noticed a change in the atmosphere on the base. Other personnel seemed more respectful when they encountered wounded veterans, and she had received several unexpected expressions of support from soldiers she barely knew. Hospital Corpsman Rodriguez had mentioned that several Army personnel had been asking detailed questions about combat medicine and the treatment of wounded veterans, but Santos assumed this was just normal military interest in medical procedures. She had no way of knowing that her situation had become the centerpiece of an intensive education program designed to teach respect for wounded warriors. On Thursday afternoon, the education program took an unexpected turn. Intelligence reports confirmed that insurgents were planning an attack on a nearby village, and the SEAL team was ordered to conduct a reconnaissance mission to assess the threat. This is it, Master Chief Reeves announced to Morrison, Thompson, and Jenkins. Real-world application of everything you've learned. The three soldiers looked at each other with a mixture of terror and disbelief. They had assumed the combat training was just theoretical, part of their punishment for disrespecting Santos. The reality of actually going outside the wire on a dangerous mission had never occurred to them. Master Chief, Morrison said, his voice shaking slightly. Are you sure we're ready for this? You tell me, Reeves replied. Do you trust your teammates to keep you alive? Do you understand what it means to depend on other people's courage and competence? Morrison thought about the past weeks of training, the lessons in teamwork and mutual dependence, and the gradual realization of how much he had to learn about being a real soldier. Yes, Master Chief, he said finally. I trust my teammates. Good, Reeves nodded. Because they're trusting you too. Don't let them down. The mission briefing was unlike anything the three soldiers had ever experienced. The SEALs outlined their plan with military precision, identifying potential threats, escape routes, and contingency procedures. Morrison, Thompson, and Jenkins were assigned specific roles in communications, logistics, and security that would be critical to the mission's success. Remember, Chief Washington told them during final preparations, this isn't a training exercise anymore. People's lives depend on you doing your jobs correctly. Think about how you'd want to be supported if you were wounded and needed help. The reference to wounded personnel was not accidental, and all three soldiers understood the connection to their treatment of Staff Sergeant Santos. As they prepared to depart the base, Morrison found himself thinking about Santos and the courage she had shown during her multiple deployments. He tried to imagine facing the same danger she had faced, dealing with improvised explosive devices while under enemy fire, and continuing to serve despite being wounded multiple times. The thought was both inspiring and humbling. Thompson was checking his equipment for the third time, his hands shaking slightly from nervousness. He thought about the memorial he had been maintaining, the names of young men and women who had died in service to their country, and the sacrifices that real warriors made every day. Jenkins was running through his medical training in his mind, hoping he would never have to use it, but knowing that lives might depend on his ability to provide first aid under fire. He thought about Hospital Corpsman Rodriguez's lessons about the trust that wounded warriors placed in the people who cared for them. As the team moved out through the base gates and into the hostile territory beyond, all three soldiers were thinking about Staff Sergeant Santos and the respect she had earned through her service and sacrifice. They were beginning to understand that they were part of something larger than themselves, a military tradition built on courage, competence, and mutual support. The mission would test everything they had learned about teamwork, trust, and what it meant to be worthy of the uniform they wore. More importantly, it would determine whether they had truly learned the lessons the SEALs had been trying to teach them about respect for wounded warriors and the sacrifices that real military service required. The Afghan countryside stretched out before them, dangerous and unforgiving. Behind them, Forward Operating Base Chapman continued its daily routine, including Staff Sergeant Santos's ongoing recovery from wounds sustained in service to her country. The three soldiers who had once dismissed her sacrifices were about to discover firsthand what combat really meant and whether they had the courage to live up to the standards she represented. The education program was entering its final phase, and the test would be administered not in a classroom or training facility, but in the crucible of actual combat where courage, competence, and character were the only things that mattered. The reconnaissance mission proved to be a harsh but transformative experience for Morrison, Thompson, and Jenkins. They had spent 18 hours in hostile territory, moving through dangerous terrain while gathering intelligence on insurgent activities. During the mission, they witnessed the SEALs operate with a level of professionalism and courage that left them awestruck. More importantly, they experienced firsthand what it meant to depend on their teammates for survival and to have others depend on them in return. The mission had been successful, but it had also been sobering. At one point, insurgent fighters had spotted their position and opened fire, forcing the team to fight their way to safety. Morrison had been responsible for calling in their coordinates for extraction support. Thompson had helped treat a SEAL who took shrapnel from a grenade, and Jenkins had managed communications during the firefight. None of them had panicked. None of them had failed their teammates. But all of them had gained a new understanding of what combat veterans like Staff Sergeant Santos had endured repeatedly throughout their careers. When they returned to Forward Operating Base Chapman the following morning, they were different men than the ones who had left. The experience of facing genuine danger alongside elite warriors had changed their perspective on military service, personal courage, and the respect owed to those who had already proven themselves in combat. Master Chief Reeves debriefed them individually, assessing their performance and ensuring they understood the lessons embedded in their experience. "How do you feel about the mission, Sergeant Morrison?" Reeves asked. Morrison thought carefully before answering. "Master Chief, it was the most frightening and educational experience of my military career. I understand now what combat veterans have been through, and I have a new level of respect for anyone who has served multiple deployments." "Including Staff Sergeant Santos?" Reeves prompted. especially Staff Sergeant Santos. Morrison replied without hesitation. Master Chief, I owe her an apology that's long overdue. My behavior toward her was inexcusable, and I want to make it right. Reeves nodded approvingly. What about you, Thompson? Master Chief, I've been thinking about all the names on the memorial I've been maintaining, Thompson said. Those people died doing what we just did, except they did it knowing they might never come home. Staff Sergeant Santos has done it 3 times and gotten wounded in the process. I can't imagine having that kind of courage. And Jenkins, Master Chief, during the firefight yesterday, I kept thinking about the medical training Corpsman Rodriguez gave me. If one of the SEALs had been seriously wounded, his life would have depended on my ability to help him. That's the kind of responsibility Staff Sergeant Santos has carried every day of her deployments. She saved lives while risking her own, and I treated her like she was some kind of burden. Reeves studied the 3 soldiers for a long moment. Gentlemen, you've all come a long way over the past few weeks. The question now is what you plan to do with what you've learned. The answer came 2 days later during a base-wide ceremony honoring wounded veterans. The event had been planned for months, but the timing seemed perfect for what the 3 soldiers needed to do. Staff Sergeant Santos was one of 5 wounded veterans being recognized during the ceremony. She sat in the front row of the base chapel, her Purple Heart and other decorations displayed prominently on her dress uniform. Despite her injuries, she maintained the bearing and dignity that marked her as a professional Marine. The base commander spoke eloquently about the sacrifices made by wounded veterans and the debt of gratitude owed to them by all military personnel. He specifically mentioned Santos's 3 deployments and her courage in the face of danger. When the ceremony concluded, Morrison, Thompson, and Jenkins approached Santos together. They had rehearsed what they wanted to say, but now that the moment had arrived, the words seemed inadequate. Staff Sergeant Santos, Morrison began, his voice respectful but clear. We want to speak with you about our behavior a few weeks ago. Santos looked at the 3 soldiers with mild curiosity. She remembered the incident outside the medical tent, but had largely put it out of her mind, focusing instead on her recovery and physical therapy. Staff Sergeant Thompson continued, we owe you an apology that should have come much sooner. Our comments and attitude toward you were completely inappropriate and disrespectful. More than that, Jenkins added, they were wrong. We didn't understand what you've sacrificed for this country, and we had no right to question your character or your injuries. Santos studied their faces, seeing something she hadn't expected, genuine remorse and respect. We've learned a lot over the past few weeks, Morrison said. We've learned about courage, about sacrifice, and about what it really means to be warriors. Most importantly, we've learned that you represent everything we should aspire to be as soldiers. Staff Sergeant Thompson said, we know an apology can't undo what we said, but we want you to know that we understand now. We understand that you've earned your place among the finest warriors this country has ever produced. Santos was quiet for a long moment, processing their words and the obvious sincerity behind them. She had dealt with disrespect before and had learned to ignore it, but she had rarely experienced such a complete reversal of attitude. Gentlemen, she said finally, apology accepted. We all make mistakes, and what matters is that we learn from them. Staff Sergeant Jenkins said, is there anything we can do to make this right? Any way we can support your recovery or help you with anything you need? Santos smiled for the first time since the conversation began. Actually, there's something. I've been working with some of the wounded veterans here on the base to develop better support programs for soldiers dealing with combat injuries. We could use some help with logistics and coordination. We'd be honored to help, Morrison said immediately. Consider it done, Thompson added. Whatever you need, Jenkins confirmed. As the 3 soldiers walked away from the chapel, they reflected on how much their lives had changed over the past few weeks. They had started as ignorant and disrespectful young men who didn't understand the sacrifices made by combat veterans. Through the patient but firm guidance of the SEALs, they had been transformed into soldiers who understood the true meaning of military service. Master Chief Reeves watched from a distance as the conversation concluded. He was satisfied with the outcome, but not surprised. His team had conducted the educational program with the same precision and dedication they brought to combat operations, and the results spoke for themselves. "Good job, Master Chief," Chief Washington said, joining his commanding officer. "Think they learned their lesson?" "I think they learned a lot more than just one lesson," Reeves replied. "They learned what it means to be part of something bigger than themselves. They learned about courage, sacrifice, and respect. Most importantly, they learned that every person who puts on this uniform deserves to be treated with dignity." Over the following weeks, Morrison, Thompson, and Jenkins became some of Staff Sergeant Santos's most dedicated supporters. They helped establish support programs for wounded veterans, volunteered for additional duties that benefited the base's medical facilities, and became advocates for proper treatment of combat-injured personnel. Morrison used his logistics expertise to streamline supply chains for medical equipment and ensure that wounded veterans had access to the best possible care. Thompson organized maintenance and improvement projects for the base's medical facilities and memorial areas. Jenkins completed advanced medical training and became certified to assist with physical therapy programs for wounded personnel. Their transformation was noticed by everyone on the base. Other personnel saw how 3 soldiers who had once been disrespectful toward wounded veterans had become their strongest advocates. The lesson was clear: disrespect for combat veterans would not be tolerated, but redemption was possible for those willing to learn and change. Staff Sergeant Santos eventually recovered enough to return to limited duty, though her combat days were over due to her injuries. She was assigned to training responsibilities at a stateside base, where she would pass on her knowledge and experience to the next generation of Marines. Before she left Forward Operating Base Chapman, she made a point of thanking Morrison, Thompson, and Jenkins for their support and assistance during her recovery. "You know," she told them during their final conversation, "the best thing about the military is that we all have the opportunity to grow and become better than we were. You've all proven that people can change when they're willing to learn from their mistakes." The 3 soldiers saluted as she departed, understanding that they were saying goodbye to someone who had taught them invaluable lessons about courage, character, and what it truly meant to serve their country. Master Chief Reeves and his SEAL team eventually rotated back to the United States, but their impact on Forward Operating Base Chapman lasted long after their departure. The culture of respect for wounded veterans that they had established became part of the base's permanent character. Morrison, Thompson, and Jenkins continued their military careers with a new understanding of their responsibilities as soldiers. They never forgot the lessons they had learned about respect, sacrifice, and the bonds that hold military units together. More importantly, they never forgot Staff Sergeant Maria Santos and the example she had set of courage, professionalism, and grace under pressure. The incident that had started with casual cruelty and disrespect had been transformed into a powerful lesson about military values and personal growth. The SEALs had demonstrated that they would protect and defend wounded veterans with the same dedication they showed in combat operations. Most importantly, they had proven that respect for those who have sacrificed for their country was not optional. It was a fundamental requirement of military service that would be enforced by warriors who understood the true meaning of honor.